The shotgun blast split the frozen Montana air before Clara Mae Whitfield's boots touched the ground. She stumbled against the stage door, heart slamming, and saw him, a tall man bleeding from the brow, standing alone in the snow with a smoking barrel leveled at 6 hired guns. He was outnumbered. He was bleeding. And he was smiling the cold, terrible smile of a man who had already decided today was a fine day to die. Nobody in the crowd moved to help him. Clara's fingers closed around the ledger book in her bag. That man, God help her, was supposed to be her husband. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me, it only gets deeper from here. Subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that frozen morning in Billings, Montana, 1882, and find out what happens when the most dangerous thing a woman can carry isn't a weapon. It's the truth, written in black ink. The 6 men from First Territorial Bank had ridden out to Cutter's Ridge at first light, which told Eli James Cutter everything he needed to know about Warren Daltry's intentions. Decent men conducted business at a desk in daylight, with witnesses present. Men who rode out before dawn to serve papers on frozen ground were not conducting business. They were conducting a burial. Mr. Cutter. The lead rider, a thick-necked man named Boggs, held up a folded document without dismounting. Mr. Daltry sends his regards. You've got until sundown to vacate the property. Eli didn't take his eyes off Boggs. That paper legal. Signed by Judge Harmon himself. Judge Harmon, Eli said, owes Daltry $4,000 in gambling debts. That a fact you'd like me to put in front of a territorial court? Boggs's jaw tightened. You got one chance here, Cutter. Walk away clean. This is my land. Eli's voice had gone flat and steady the way it always went when he'd moved past fear into something colder. I've got a deed signed in 1878. 3 years of payments on record at that very bank. And I've got this. He raised the shotgun. Not threatening, just present. The way a man stated a fact. So, you ride back to Daltry, and you tell him if he wants Cutter's Ridge, he can come get it himself. I'd like to look him in the eye when he tries. That was the moment the stage from Helena rolled in. Clara Mae Whitfield had spent 19 days on coaches, trains, and 1 questionable river ferry to reach Billings, Montana territory. She had rehearsed the introduction 100 times. She had imagined a modest house, a nervous man, holding his hat, the awkward but hopeful beginning of something new. She had not imagined 6 armed riders and a man bleeding from a gash above his right eye, holding a shotgun, with the particular stillness of someone who had used one before and found the experience unremarkable. She gripped the doorframe of the stage and did not move. Ma'am. The driver behind her cleared his throat. I need you to step down. Clara stepped down. Boggs and his men had not moved. Neither had Eli. The standoff had the quality of a clock wound too tight, and every person gathered at the edge of the road seemed to understand that the spring could snap at any second. Clara looked at the man with the shotgun. Dark eyes, jaw set hard, blood drying against his temple in the cold. He hadn't noticed her yet. He was counting riders the way a man counted bullets, with complete, unhurried attention. She looked at the 6 armed men. She looked at the folded document in Boggs's hand, and then, because Clara Mae Whitfield had grown up in a Philadelphia accounting office and understood that paper was often more dangerous than gunpowder, she did something that surprised even herself. She walked forward. Excuse me. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. May I see that document? Every head turned. Boggs stared at her like she'd stepped out of a fever dream. Ma'am, this ain't your concern. The man you're serving those papers to is Eli James Cutter. She kept walking. Then it absolutely is my concern. Eli turned then. He looked at her the way a man looked at something he could not immediately classify as threat or hallucination. Who are you? Clara Mae Whitfield. She stopped 2 feet from Boggs and held out her hand, palm up steady, as she could manage in the cold. "The document, please." Boggs actually handed it to her. Clara suspected later that he'd been so thoroughly confused he'd acted on reflex. She unfolded it. Her eyes moved fast the way her father had taught her, not reading word by word, but scanning for the clause, the buried condition, the sentence written in slightly smaller type than the rest. It took her 38 seconds. "This acceleration clause." She didn't look up. "It references Section 4 of the original loan agreement. Do you have the original loan agreement present?" Boggs blinked. "What?" "The document you're attempting to enforce references conditions established in Section 4 of a prior contract." Clara folded the paper with precise corners and held it back out. "Without the predicate document attached, this enforcement action has no legal standing. You're serving papers on a clause that requires supporting documentation that isn't here." She finally looked up. "Mr. Cutter does not have until sundown to vacate. He has until whatever date his original loan comes due, which, if his last payment was made in September, is no earlier than March of next year." The silence that followed was the kind that came after something irrevocable had been said. Boggs looked at the document. He looked at Clara. He looked at Eli. "We'll be back," Boggs said. "Bring Section 4, Clara replied. The 6 men rode. Eli lowered the shotgun slowly. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He watched the riders until they disappeared past the tree line. Then he turned and looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, not hostility, something more complicated than either. "Who sent you?" he said. "A man named George Aldridge. He said he was your ranch hand." Something moved through Eli's face. George. The name came out flat, as a stone dropped on frozen ground. "George wrote to you." "George wrote to me on your behalf," Clara said carefully. "He placed an advertisement in the Philadelphia Register. I answered it. We corresponded for 11 weeks. She reached into her bag and produced a bundle of letters tied with twine. "He represented himself as you." Eli stared at the letters. He put one hand over his face and breathed out slowly through his nose. "How much did you pay to get here?" "Every dollar I had." "Damn." "Yes," Clara said. That seemed like a fair assessment of the situation. He dropped his hand and looked at her directly for the first time. She held the look. She had learned early that the surest way to lose a negotiation was to look away first. "Miss Whitfield," Eli said, "I am sorry you came all this way. I am sorry George did what he did without my knowledge or consent. And I need you to understand clearly that I am not looking for a wife. I have never been looking for a wife, and the fact that my ranch hand decided to arrange my personal life is something I will be addressing with him at considerable volume. I will pay your return fare." "I can't go back to Philadelphia." "Why not?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Not because she lacked an answer. She was deciding how much truth to give a man she'd known for 4 minutes. "The accounting firm my father built was taken from me after he died," she said. "His partner claimed my father's share on the grounds that as a woman I had no legal standing to inherit a business interest. I had no money for a lawyer. By the time I received Mr. Aldridge's first letter, I had $7 and a train ticket to nowhere." She kept her eyes on his. "I am not going back to nothing. I would rather build something new from the ground up than retreat to a city that has already decided what I'm worth." Eli said nothing for a long moment. "You read that enforcement document in under a minute," he said. 38 seconds, I counted. "And you knew about the acceleration clause." "My father handled debt collection cases. I worked beside him from the time I was 12. I know how bank documents are written, and I know where lenders hide language that benefits them." She held his gaze. "Your banker buried that clause in a dependent reference on purpose, Mr. Cutter. That is not a clerical error. Someone wrote that contract intending to use it against you when the moment was right." Something moved through Eli's expression, not quite surprise, but the particular look of a man who had suspected something ugly and was now having it confirmed. "Come inside," he said. "I thought you weren't interested in a wife." "I'm not." He turned toward the house. "But I might be interested in someone who can read a contract." Inside, Eli set the shotgun against the wall and turned to face her. In the better light, she could see the cut above his brow was deeper than she'd first thought. "That needs cleaning," Clara said. "It's fine." "It isn't, but that's your business." She set her bag on the table. "How long has Daltry been doing this?" Eli went to the stove and poured coffee into 2 tin cups without asking if she wanted any. He set one in front of her and took the other to the far end of the table. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it. "6 months ago, I started getting notices," he said. "Small things at first. Claims that I'd missed a payment in June of last year. I had the receipt. Then a claim that the property boundary survey was in dispute. I paid for a new survey. That came back clean." He paused. "Every time I answered one claim, there was another. Every time I proved them wrong, they found a different angle. I'm a fair hand with cattle, and I know this land better than I know my own face. But I don't know bank law. I don't know what to look for in a contract written by someone who does. Do you have your original loan agreement? Filed in the strong box under my bed. May I see it?" He looked at her across the table. "You just got off a stage after 19 days of travel. I'm aware of that. Most people would want to rest. Most people aren't sitting in a house that's going to be taken unless someone finds what Warren Daltry put in Section 4. She held his gaze. "I'm not most people, Mr. Cutter." Eli got the strong box. The original loan agreement was 12 pages written in the dense, crawling hand of a man who had gone to some trouble to make it difficult to read. Clara spread it on the table and began at the beginning, her finger running along each line, her lips moving slightly. Eli sat across from her and said nothing. She appreciated that. Men who interrupted her when she was reading documents had learned quickly it was not a profitable habit. She found Section 4 on page 8. She read it twice. Then she set her finger on the page and looked up. "There it is," she said. "What?" "Section 4 establishes an acceleration clause triggered by, and I'm reading directly, any material change in the assessed operating capacity of the collateralized property. That phrase is not defined anywhere else in this document." She looked at him. "It means whatever Daltry wants it to mean. Last spring, did anything change on this ranch? A drought, a disease in the herd, anything that could be characterized as a reduction in capacity?" Eli's jaw tightened. "Lost 40 head to a fever in April. Reported to the county assessor. And Daltry is on the county finance board." "He is." "He waited for an adverse event," Clara said. "Something he knew was likely to happen eventually on any working ranch. The moment it did, he had grounds under Section 4 to accelerate the loan, make the full balance immediately due. You can't pay a full balance immediately. Nobody can, so he gets the land." She pulled the document closer. "But the clause requires proper written notice delivered within 30 days of the triggering event. The fever in your herd was April. When did you receive your first notice from the bank?" Eli went still. He stood and moved to the wooden crate in the corner, going through papers with deliberate hands. It took him 2 minutes. He laid a letter on the table. Clara looked at the postmark, then she looked at him. "This was sent in August," she said. 4 months after the triggering event. Their own clause required 30 days. She pressed her finger to the postmark. "They missed their own deadline, Mr. Cutter. This enforcement action is void." The room was very quiet. "How certain are you?" Eli said. "Certain enough to put my name on the filing." She held his gaze. "A formal challenge to the enforcement citing defective notice filed with the territorial court before Daltry can get a sympathetic judge to rubber stamp his paperwork. The challenge needs to be airtight. It needs someone who can present the financial timeline clearly in language a court will accept. You can do that. I've been doing that since I was 15 years old." A pause. I need a place to stay while I work on it. Not here, she added before he could speak. I understand that's not appropriate, and I'm not asking for charity. But I need to be in Billings close to the county records office and the telegraph. Is there a boarding house? Ruth Nakamura runs one on the south end of Maine. She's decent and doesn't ask unnecessary questions. In exchange for this work, I'll ask for nothing in advance. If the challenge succeeds and you keep the ranch, I'd ask for 3 months' wages as an account manager. If it fails, you owe me nothing. Eli looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Clara had to remind herself not to fill the silence with words, a habit she was still correcting. Why? He said finally. Why what? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You came here for a husband and found a disaster. Most sensible people would get back on that stage. Clara was quiet for a moment. When I was 22 years old, she said, I watched a man named Gerald Croft take everything my father built. He used a legal instrument my father had signed without fully understanding, and he used it correctly and legally, and in full view of God and the state of Pennsylvania. I had nothing to fight him with. I didn't have the knowledge or the resources. She looked at the loan agreement between them. I have them now. And what's happening to you is the same mechanism being used by the same kind of man. The only difference is, it hasn't finished happening yet. She stood and began folding the document. I don't like leaving things unfinished, Mr. Cutter. She handed him back the agreement. Their fingers didn't touch. She was precise about that. George is going to be mucking stalls for a month, Eli said. That seems proportionate. Clara picked up her bag. If you can pull together every piece of correspondence from the bank, every notice, every letter, every receipt, I'll start building the timeline tonight. Tonight? We don't know how fast Daltry moves. He had 6 men out here this morning. That's not a man who's being patient. She moved toward the door, then stopped. She turned back. What you did out there, standing your ground alone like that. She paused. That was either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, Eli said. Bring the documents to Mrs. Nakamura's by 7 o'clock. She walked out into the frozen Montana morning. Behind her, she heard Eli Cutter say something low and quiet that sounded like it might have been directed at George Aldridge, or at Warren Daltry, or at the general absurdity of the morning, or at all three simultaneously. Ruth Nakamura took Clara's measure in a single pass when the small brass bell above her door announced her arrival. The woman who came from the back was compact and direct, with eyes that were neither warm nor cold, but simply thorough. Room, Ruth said. Yes, ma'am. Indefinitely if you have it. You just arrived. On the morning stage. I had some business to attend to first. Ruth studied her. You're the one who sent Daltry's men packing. Word travels fast. In Billings, bad news travels fast, and interesting news travels faster. Ruth moved toward the stairs. Corner room. Better light for document work, and I suspect that's what you'll be doing. Clara looked at her. How do you know that? Because Eli Cutter hasn't let a soul near that bank business in 6 months. The fact that you came out of that confrontation walking toward his house instead of away from it tells me you said something that interested him. Ruth paused on the second step. What's your name? Clara Mae Whitfield. Ruth Nakamura. She continued up the stairs. I'll have hot water sent up, and Miss Whitfield Warren Daltry has put 3 families off their land in the past 2 years. The Henley place, the Morrison homestead, the Birch Creek parcel. Everyone had a loan from First Territorial. Everyone had a bad season. She stopped at the top of the stairs and turned her voice dropping low and very even. Whatever you're planning to do, do it carefully. That man has a long reach, and he does not like losing. Clara met her eyes. Neither do I. Eli arrived at 7 minutes past 7 with a canvas satchel that clinked with the weight of rubber-banded correspondence. He set it on the table in the small sitting room Ruth had made available, and he stood there holding his hat, looking like a man who'd made a decision and was still deciding whether it had been the right one. "Sit down, Mr. Cutter," Clara said, without looking up from the timeline she was already building. "You've been at this since this morning. Ruth fed me at noon. I ate while I worked." She held out her hand. "The satchel." He sat. He handed it over. She went through the contents methodically, payment receipts to the left, bank correspondence to the right, disputed notices in the center. Her hands moved quickly and without hesitation. "Tell me about your payment history," she said. "Not whether you paid. I know you paid. I'm asking about the method." "First 2 years, I wrote in every month and paid at the counter. Took a receipt every time. Third year, I started sending George. He made supply runs anyway." Clara looked up. "George handled payments for the past 8 months. About that. And he brought back receipts." A pause. A longer one than Clara would have liked. "He said he did," Eli said. Clara looked at the receipts in front of her. She counted. She looked at the timeline on her page. "There are 3 months in the past 8 with no receipt here. March, May, and July." The silence that followed was thorough. "George wouldn't steal from me," Eli said. "I've known that man 12 years. I'm not suggesting he stole. I'm telling you the bank has no record of payment for those months, and you have no receipt. What I don't yet know is whether the money was paid, and the bank manufactured a gap, or whether the money never reached the counter." She kept her voice even. "Either version creates a problem, but they require different solutions. Is there any way to verify what George actually did on those supply days? I'll talk to him. Before you do, be careful. If George made those payments and someone at the bank redirected the funds and destroyed the receipt, he's a witness. And witnesses in cases involving men like Daltry have a way of developing sudden memory problems." She looked at him steadily. "You were a lawman once." It wasn't a question. Eli went still. "George mentioned that the letters described you as a man who had given up a badge because he'd seen how badly justice could fail. That's a specific kind of thing to say about someone." Eli set his hat on the table. He looked at the wall. "I was a deputy marshal for 5 years. Out of Laramie first, then Carson City." His voice went flat, the way voices went flat when words had been turned over so many times in a man's own head that all the edges had worn off. "There was a man named Alderton, accused of killing a ranch owner in a land dispute. I was the arresting officer. I built the case. I was absolutely certain." Clara waited. "He was hanged in November of 1879, Eli said. In March of 1880, a drifter confessed to the killing on his deathbed. Every detail matched. Alderton hadn't done it." He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. "I walked away from the badge the week after. Came up to Montana. Filed on land nobody else wanted and started over." The lamp between them flickered in a draft from under the door. "You're telling me this," Clara said quietly, "because you want me to understand why you spent 6 months fighting Daltry alone instead of asking for help." He met her eyes. Something in his expression shifted, not quite surprise, but close. "A man who got another man killed through overconfidence doesn't easily trust his own judgment again," Clara continued, "especially not when the next fight requires him to trust someone else's." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to trust me blindly, Mr. Cutter. I'm asking you to look at the work and judge it on its merits. Let the documents speak. That's all." A long moment passed between them. "March, May, July," Clara said, turning back to her page. "Think back carefully. Did George seem troubled on any of those supply days? Did he come back later than usual? Anything different about him in the weeks after?" Eli was quiet. Clara wrote while he thought, building columns, laying the architecture of what she would need to argue before a court. "May," he said finally. "He came back late. Said the road was bad, which it wasn't. I noticed, but didn't push." A pause. He was quiet for about a week after. "Someone at the bank likely told him there was a problem with the payment and pressured him to stay quiet about it." Clara made a note. "Who is the head teller at First Territorial?" "Man named Cooper, Daltry's nephew." Clara wrote that down. Tomorrow morning, I need to go to the county records office and pull the property transfer records for the Henley place, the Morrison homestead, and the Birch Creek parcel, she said. If the same mechanism was used each time, same clause, same defective notice pattern, that establishes a pattern of practice. A court looking at 3 instances of the same fraud is looking at something very different from a single contract dispute. Eli watched her. What you're doing right now, building that? How long does that take? To build the timeline a night, to prepare a filing strong enough to withstand a challenge from Daltry's lawyers. She looked at him. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Daltry won't wait 3 weeks. I know. That's why I'm still working. She paused. The Morrison homestead and the Birch Creek parcel. Do you know what happened to the families? Eli's hands were flat on the table. The Henleys left with 1 wagon and a mule. Their land sold at auction the following week for 1/4 of its value. The buyer was a holding company registered in Chicago. He paused. Nobody could prove it was Daltry's money. But you believed it was. I know it was. His voice was quiet and careful. I just can't prove it. Not yet, Clara said. She organized the last of the documents and began labeling the columns of her timeline in clear, precise handwriting. Outside Billings had gone quiet in the way frontier towns went quiet in winter. Not peacefully, but with the particular silence of people indoors and watchful. Get some sleep, Mr. Cutter, Clara said. Bring George Aldridge here tomorrow. Don't tell him why. Just bring him. You want to talk to him yourself. I want to ask him questions he can answer honestly if he knows he's being believed instead of accused. There's a difference. She glanced up briefly. I think George Aldridge has been carrying something he doesn't know how to set down. Eli stood. He looked at the table covered in sorted documents, careful columns, red ink marking every gap and discrepancy, and his expression was something Clara couldn't name. Not gratitude, not trust, not yet, but something moving in that direction. He sent for you because he was desperate, Eli said. He's been watching me lose this fight for months and didn't know what else to do. I know. He shouldn't have done it the way he did. No, but here we are. Eli looked at her a moment longer. Here we are, he said. He left. Clara turned back to her timeline. She wrote until the second lamp burned low, and when she finally set down her pen, the page in front of her held the complete financial history of Cutter's Ridge, every payment, every notice, every gap marked in red, every discrepancy noted in the margin. Warren Daltry had been careful. She could see the intelligence in how he'd constructed it. The buried clause, the manufactured gaps, the defective notice buried just far enough under procedure that most people would never find it. He had built something that looked from the outside like legitimate debt enforcement, but he had been sloppy about the dates. And dates in Clara Mae Whitfield's experience were where men like Warren Daltry always made their mistakes. They were patient enough to set the trap and confident enough to believe no one on the other side could read it. They counted on the people they were stealing from, not knowing how to find the fine print. She closed her ledger. She blew out the last lamp. In the dark of the corner room above Ruth Nakamura's boarding house, with the frozen Montana wind working at the window seams, Clara allowed herself one moment to feel the full weight of where she was. 2,000 miles from Philadelphia. Arrived that morning. Already inside a fight with a powerful man she'd never met on behalf of a man who hadn't asked for her and didn't entirely trust her yet. She thought about her father. About the afternoon he'd walked her through her first account ledger, running his finger along the columns and saying in his dry, careful way, "The numbers always tell the truth." Clara Mae. People lie. Circumstances change. But the numbers always tell the truth. She reached for her pen. She opened to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote a single line. What does Warren Daltry not want us to find? Then she began answering her own question. George Aldridge was a small man with large hands and the permanently apologetic expression of someone who had spent most of his life anticipating the consequences of his own decisions. He arrived at Ruth Nakamura's sitting room the next morning with his hat already in his hands, which told Clara everything she needed to know about his state of mind before he said a single word. Eli stood by the window. He had not told George why they were there. He had simply said, "Come," and George had come, and now he stood in the doorway, looking between the two of them with the specific terror of a man who knew the reckoning had arrived and had no idea which shape it would take. "Sit down, Mr. Aldridge," Clara said. George sat. "My name is Clara Mae Whitfield. You wrote to me for 11 weeks using Mr. Cutter's name and representing yourself as him." She kept her voice even. "I'm not here to discuss that. I need you to answer some questions about 3 specific dates, and I need you to tell me the truth, because what you say in the next 10 minutes may be the only thing that keeps this ranch from being handed over to Warren Daltry by the end of the month." George's hands tightened on his hat. He looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him without expression, which was its own kind of answer. "March," Clara said. "You made the payment run. What happened?" George was quiet for a moment. Then something in his shoulders gave way like a man setting down a load he'd been carrying too long. "I paid," he said. "Counted the money out myself from the strong box same as always. Went to the counter. Cooper was at the window." He stopped. "Go on." "He took the money. Wrote out the receipt. Then he said there was a problem with the account, said he needed me to wait while he spoke to Mr. Daltry." George turned his hat over in his hands. "I waited near an hour. When Cooper came back, he gave me the receipt and said everything was settled, not to worry about it. I came home." "And the receipt," Clara said. George went still. "He asked me to leave it with him. Said they needed to attach it to an account correction document. Said they'd send a copy to Mr. Cutter." He swallowed. "They never did." "And you didn't tell me," Eli said from the window. His voice was flat. "He told me not to." George looked up at Eli with an expression that had gone past apology into something rawer. "Cooper told me if I said anything, if I made trouble, the bank would call the full loan due immediately on grounds of account irregularity. He said it real quiet and real polite, and he smiled the whole time he said it." George stopped. "I didn't know what to do, Eli. I thought if I said nothing, maybe it would just... I thought maybe they'd let it go." "But they didn't," Clara said. "No, ma'am." "May and July," Clara said. Same pattern. May was different. I paid, got a receipt. Cooper didn't say a word. I came home. 2 weeks later, Eli got a notice saying the May payment was deficient, that the amount was $30 short of what was owed. Was it? No. I counted it twice before I left, and once more when I got there. It wasn't short. George's voice had gone hard in a way that suggested this particular injustice had been sitting in him a long time. "But I didn't have the receipt anymore. I'd left it on the kitchen table and it went missing." Clara made a note. "And July." "July, I never made it to the counter." George looked down at his hat. "Cooper met me at the door. Said the bank was closed for an internal audit. Said to come back Monday. I came back Monday, and he said the payment window was that day that I'd missed it." He paused. "I knew then that they were doing something deliberate. I just didn't know how to prove it, and I didn't know what to do. And I was scared, if I'm being honest. These aren't men you can just go argue with." The room held his words for a moment. "You wrote the letters because you thought I might be able to help," Clara said. George looked up at her. "I didn't know what else to do. I'd seen the way things were going for 6 months, and I knew Eli wouldn't ask for help himself. He's not..." George glanced at Eli, then back. "He's not built for asking. And I figured maybe if there was someone here who understood accounts and contracts, someone with a reason to stay and fight, maybe..." He stopped. "I know I shouldn't have done it the way I did. I know that. I'm sorry for putting you through that journey under false pretenses. That was wrong. I just didn't know another way." Clara looked at him for a long moment. I need you to write down everything you just told me. Dates, names, exactly what Cooper said. Every detail you remember in your own hand and signed. Would that help? It's the beginning of a sworn account of deliberate payment suppression. Yes, it would help. She set paper and a pen in front of him. Write carefully and completely. Take your time. George looked at the paper. He looked at the pen. He picked it up with his large roughened hands and began to write with the careful concentration of a man who had not put pen to paper often, but understood the weight of what he was writing. Eli came away from the window. He walked past Clara without speaking and went into the hall. She followed him. They stood in the narrow hallway with the sounds of Ruth Nakamura's boarding house around them, the creak of floors, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the cold working its way through the walls. 12 years, Eli said quietly enough that it didn't carry. He's been with me 12 years, and he was scared enough of those men that he sat on that for months. He was trying to protect you, Clara said. Badly and by the wrong method, but that was the intent. I know what the intent was. Eli was looking at the wall. That doesn't change that I spent 6 months fighting blind when I didn't have to. You spent 6 months fighting blind because Warren Daltry spent considerable effort making sure you had no useful information. That's not a failure of your judgment, Mr. Cutter. That's the nature of what he does. She paused. He wins by making the person he's stealing from feel like the problem is them, their debts, their failures, their inability to keep up. He relies on people being too ashamed of the trouble they're in to ask for help. George was scared. You were proud. Daltry counted on both. Eli was quiet. Does that make it easier? He said. No. But it makes it accurate. He turned and looked at her. Not the assessing look he'd given her yesterday, not the cautious calculation of a man deciding whether to trust a stranger. Something more direct than that, and for a moment she felt the full weight of it. You sleep at all, he said. A few hours. Ruth feed you this morning. I wasn't hungry. That's not what I asked. Clara looked at him. I had coffee. That's not food. He held her gaze for a moment, then something shifted and he turned back toward the sitting room. George doesn't leave until he's eaten something too. He looks like he hasn't slept in a month. Clara returned to the sitting room and waited while George wrote. She read over his account when he finished. It was thorough, more thorough than she'd expected, the details sharp and specific in the way that came from a man who had been replaying the events in his own head every night since they happened. She set the account in her folder. One more thing, she said. The letters you wrote to me. Where did you send them from? George looked uncomfortable. Cooper's cousin runs the telegraph office. I used the stage office, paid the driver to carry them, and collect replies on his Helena run. Good. That means there's no record at the local telegraph of our correspondence. Clara closed the folder. Don't speak to anyone about what you've told us today. Not a word to anyone at the bank, not to anyone in town, until I tell you otherwise. If Cooper, or anyone from First Territorial approaches you, you know nothing, you've done nothing, and you're not concerned about anything. Can you do that? George straightened in his chair. He had the look of a man who had been offered a way to stand upright after a long time crouching. Yes, ma'am, I can do that. After he left, Clara spread the county records she had requested through Ruth across the table alongside Eli's documents. The Henley property transfer, the Morrison homestead closing, the Birch Creek deed reassignment. She laid them out in order and stood back so Eli could look at them with her. All three had acceleration clauses, she said. Different wording, but the same mechanism. All three had adverse events recorded with the county assessor in the season before enforcement. She ran her finger along the transfer records. All three parcels transferred through auction to a Chicago holding company called Meridian Land Associates within 6 weeks of the family's vacating. She looked at Eli. The same company all 3 times. Eli's jaw was tight. You can tie Meridian to Daltry. Not yet directly, but Meridian was registered in Illinois in 1879. I can request the registration documents through the territorial government's records office. That takes time. She paused. What I can do now and quickly is file the challenge to your enforcement action based on defective notice. That stops the clock. It gives us time to build the larger argument. How long does the challenge buy us? If it's well argued, the court has to schedule a hearing before any enforcement can proceed. In practice, that means 4 to 6 weeks minimum, probably longer if the docket is full. She looked at him. That's enough time to pull the Meridian records, and enough time to build a case that shows this isn't one bad loan. It's a pattern. And if Daltry gets to the judge first? It wasn't a question. Then we need the filing in front of a judge before Daltry has time to make any arrangements. Clara turned and looked at him directly. I need to know something, and I need you to answer honestly. Is there anyone on the territorial bench you trust? Eli thought. The thinking took long enough that Clara knew he was being careful rather than evasive, and she appreciated the difference. Judge Adeline Marsh, he said. She rode circuit out of Helena for 8 years before she was appointed to the bench in Billings. She's been here 3 years. Daltry's tried twice to get favorable rulings from her, and she hasn't given him either one. He paused. She's also not the sort of woman who responds well to having her docket manipulated. Is she sitting this week? Through Friday. I need this filing in front of her before she leaves. Clara looked at the clock on Ruth's mantel. I can have it ready by tomorrow morning. You were going to sleep. I'll sleep after Friday. Eli crossed his arms. You cannot work all night again. Mr. Cutter, with respect. You've been awake for the better part of 2 days. A filing full of errors because the person who wrote it was exhausted doesn't help anyone. His voice wasn't harsh, but it had the particular quality of someone used to being listened to. Ruth goes to bed at 9. The records office doesn't open until 8 in the morning. You have exactly nothing to do between 9 tonight and 8 tomorrow that can't be done better after you've slept. Clara opened her mouth. Closed it. He was right, which was irritating. I'll work until 8 tonight, she said. Fine. And I need you to pull whatever correspondence you have about the county assessor's visit in April. The one where the fever in your herd was recorded. I can do that. And I need the name of the midwife who attended the Morrison family. Ruth mentioned the wife was with child when they were put off the land. I want to know where they went. Eli looked at her. Why? Because if they were put out in winter with a pregnant woman, someone helped them. And whoever helped them may know things that didn't end up in any official record. She met his gaze. People like Daltry make one consistent mistake. They focus entirely on the legal and financial instruments, and they forget that the people they harm remember everything. Every word that was said to them, every document they were shown, every threat, however politely worded. She paused. The Henleys and the Morrisons are witnesses to a pattern. I want to know if they're reachable. Eli was quiet for a moment. Tom Henley runs a feed supply out of Red Lodge now. It's 2 days' ride. I can't go to Red Lodge, but you can write to him. Clara pulled a fresh sheet from her folder and set it on the table. Tell him we're building a case and we need his account. Ask him if he still has any documents from the bank. People who've been run off don't always want to come back and fight. No, Clara said. But people who've been run off and watched it happen to someone else afterward sometimes decide enough is enough. She looked at him. Write the letter. Eli sat down and wrote the letter. Clara worked beside him, building the legal argument section by section, her pen moving steadily through the afternoon while the winter light shifted, and Ruth brought them both coffee, without being asked, and set it down without interrupting. At some point, Eli finished the letter and simply stayed at the table reading through the documents she'd organized the previous night, asking occasional questions that were precise and relevant, and told her he understood more about his situation than he had let on in their first conversation. He'd been fighting blind for 6 months, but he hadn't been fighting stupidly. He'd known something was wrong. He simply hadn't known where to look. The acceleration clause, he said at one point, setting down a document. You found it in under a minute. I knew what I was looking for. How? Clara looked up. Because Gerald Croft used a nearly identical clause when he took my father's firm. He called it a performance deterioration provision. Same mechanism, different language. She held his gaze. I have read that kind of clause in my sleep for 4 years, Mr. Cutter. I have woken up at 3 in the morning thinking about the exact sentence structure and where it was buried on the page. A pause. If there is one type of legal instrument I will recognize instantly and correctly for the rest of my natural life, it is that one. Eli looked at her steadily. Is that why you answered George's letter? Not because of the situation you were in, but because of what the letters described. Clara was quiet for a moment. The letters described a man dealing with a fraudulent bank claim on his land, she said. That's not a coincidence I was in a position to ignore. She looked back at her work. It wasn't only desperation that got me on that stage, Mr. Cutter. It was recognition. The word sat between them. At 7:45, Clara set down her pen and organized everything she had into 2 folders, the filing and the supporting evidence, and stacked them precisely at the edge of the table. She rolled the tension from her wrist, which had been cramping for the last hour. The challenge is drafted, she said. I need to review it once more in the morning with fresh eyes before I'd put my name on it. But the argument is there. Eli looked at the stack of folders. He had the expression of a man looking at something that represented more than it appeared to not just paper, but months of fear beginning to take a different shape. If this works, he said. When it works. He looked at her. I don't make promises I can't keep, Clara said. But this argument is sound. The notice was defective. The dates are documented. George's account corroborates the payment suppression. She met his eyes. Daltry has been relying on nobody being able to read what he wrote. That advantage is gone. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working hard against the north side of the building, the way Montana wind worked in February, not as weather, but as a reminder of what the land was capable of when it chose to be unforgiving. My ranch hand forged letters to bring you here, Eli said finally. You came 2,000 miles for a husband you didn't get and a fight you didn't ask for. You've been working for 36 hours on behalf of a man who can't pay you until a court says he still owns something worth paying with. He paused. I don't know how to account for that. Clara began putting on her coat. You don't need to account for it. You need to get me in front of Judge Marsh by Thursday. She picked up her folders. Get some sleep, Mr. Cutter. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. She walked to her room and locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed in her coat for a full minute before she took it off because she needed a moment that was entirely her own in which she did not have to be precise or composed or certain. Then she lay down, and for the first time in weeks she slept without dreaming about Philadelphia. Judge Adeline Marsh had the kind of face that had stopped pretending to be agreeable sometime around 1870 and had been more useful ever since. She was 61 years old, had outlived 2 husbands and 1 territorial governor who had tried to remove her from the bench, and she read legal documents the way Clara read bank contracts, fast, thorough, and with an expression that gave nothing away until she was ready to give something. She read the challenge filing twice without speaking. Clara sat across from her in the small chambers behind the Billings courthouse and kept her hands folded on the table and did not fill the silence with words. Eli stood by the door. He had worn his good coat, which Ruth had informed Clara was the dark wool one, not the working one, and the distinction apparently mattered. Judge Marsh set the document down. The defective notice argument is sound, she said. The dates are documented and the clause language is specific about the 30-day window. She looked at Clara. You drafted this? Yes, Your Honor. You're not a lawyer. No, Your Honor, I'm an accountant. An accountant who understands acceleration clause enforcement procedure. My father handled debt collection cases. I worked beside him for 9 years. Judge Marsh looked at her for a long moment with the unhurried assessment of someone who had seen a great many people attempt to stand in front of her and was deciding what category this one belonged to. The payment suppression account from the ranch hand George Aldridge. This is sworn, signed and witnessed by Mrs. Ruth Nakamura. Ruth Nakamura's witness carries weight in this county. The judge looked at Eli. You understand that filing this challenge will not endear you to Warren Daltry. I was already not endearing to Warren Daltry, Eli said. You were a nuisance before. This makes you a problem. She tapped the filing with one finger. There's a difference, Mr. Cutter, between a man Daltry has decided to remove and a man who has decided to fight back with documentation. The first kind he handles through his bank. The second kind he handles through other methods. What kind of other methods? Clara said. Judge Marsh looked at her steadily. The kind that don't go through my courtroom. A pause. I'm telling you this not to discourage the filing. I'm telling you so that you understand what you are walking into with your eyes open. She picked up the document again. I'll schedule the hearing for 2 weeks from Thursday. That's the earliest I can put it on the docket without it appearing irregular. She set it down. In the meantime, this filing is a matter of public record as of the moment my clerk stamps it. Daltry will know by this afternoon. I know, Clara said, and you're prepared for that. We're prepared for that, Clara said. She felt rather than saw Eli look at her when she said we. The clerk stamped the filing at 10:47 in the morning. By noon, Clara could feel the change in the way people moved around her on Billings Main Street. The slight recalibration of attention, the way eyes tracked her and Eli a half-second longer than they had the day before. Word traveled the way Judge Marsh had said it would. Ruth met them at the boarding house door with an expression that was as close to worried as her face appeared to get. Cooper came by while you were at the courthouse, she said. Asked whether you were still staying here. I told him that was my business and not his, and sent him along. She held the door. Come inside. Cooper came here himself, Eli said. In person, which means Daltry wanted to know your situation quickly enough that he didn't wait for a report. Ruth looked between them. That filing stirred something. Good, Clara said. Ruth looked at her. Child, when a man like Daltry gets stirred, it is not always good for the people who stirred him. It's better than the alternative, Clara said. The alternative was letting him take the ranch quietly. She set her folders on the table. Has anyone else come by? Anyone asking questions about Mr. Cutter or about me? Not yet. When they do, and they will, you haven't seen anything noteworthy. We work, we eat, we sleep. Nothing interesting. Clara looked at Ruth directly. I'm sorry to put you in the middle of this. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a dismissal and not quite agreement. I was in the middle of this before you arrived, Miss Whitfield. The Henley family stayed in this house for 3 nights before they left for Red Lodge. Eleanor Morrison sat at that table and cried for 2 hours the week they were put off their land. She paused. I've been waiting for someone to come along who could read what Daltry was doing well enough to say it out loud in court. I'm not sorry it's you. I'm just telling you to be careful. The letter from Tom Henley arrived on the 4th day. Eli recognized the handwriting before he opened it and brought it directly to Clara, who was at the table building the Meridian Land Associates file from registration documents that had come back through the territorial office that morning. She read it once, then handed it to Eli. He has the original loan documents, she said. Kept copies of everything, which tells me Tom Henley is a more careful man than Daltry gave him credit for. She paused. He also kept the enforcement notice. He says the postmark was stamped 11 weeks after the triggering event. Eli looked up from the letter. 11 weeks. His clause had the same 30-day window, same defective notice pattern. Clara took the letter back and placed it in the Meridian file. 3 ranches, the same mechanism every time, the same holding company receiving the auctioned land. She spread the Meridian registration documents across the table. The company was registered by a Chicago law firm called Aldrich and Price. I wrote to the Illinois Territorial Records Office yesterday requesting the named principals. How long for a reply? A week, maybe 10 days. But I don't need the Meridian principles to make the argument in front of Judge Marsh. The defective notice challenge stands on its own. She looked at him. The Meridian connection is for what comes after. Once we've established that Daltry's enforcement is void, the question becomes whether what he did constitutes deliberate fraud. 3 instances of the same defective mechanism, used against the same type of collateral, all transferred to the same purchasing entity. She paused. That's not sloppy paperwork, Mr. Cutter. That's a system. Eli set down the letter. And if we can prove it's a system, then it's not a civil challenge to a loan enforcement. It's a criminal matter. Clara kept her voice even. That's a different kind of court and a different kind of consequence for Warren Daltry. He was quiet for a moment. You've been planning that from the beginning. I've been building toward it from the beginning, she said. There's a difference. I planned the defective notice challenge. Everything else depends on what the documents say. She met his eyes. So far, the documents are saying a great deal. The trouble arrived on the 6th day, and it arrived in the form of a man Clara had not anticipated. Not Daltry himself, not Cooper, not Boggs, but a lawyer from Helena named Prescott, who showed up at the courthouse with a counterfiling that was, Clara had to admit, impressively constructed. She got a copy through Judge Marsh's clerk by mid-afternoon and read it standing in the courthouse hallway because she could not wait to get back to Ruth's. Prescott was arguing that the 30-day notice requirement in Section 4 had been satisfied by an informal verbal notification delivered to George Aldridge at the bank counter in March, and that under Territorial Commercial Code, verbal notification from an authorized bank officer to an authorized agent of the borrower constituted valid notice. Clara read it twice. She folded it. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand flat against the wall and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. Then she straightened and walked out into the cold. Eli was waiting with the horses outside. He read her expression before she said a word. How bad? It's not bad, she said. It's clever. There's a difference. She took a breath of frozen air. He's arguing that Cooper's conversation with George in March constituted valid verbal notice under commercial code. If the court accepts that the notice defect disappears. Eli was quiet. Can he make that argument hold? He said. He can make the argument. Whether it holds depends on 2 things. She looked at him. First, whether George's account is credible enough to establish that Cooper's statement was not a formal notice, but a coercive instruction to stay quiet. There's a meaningful legal distinction between notifying someone of a clause and threatening them into silence. Second, she paused. Whether Section 4 itself specifies written notice. Does it? I don't know yet. I need to read Section 4 again against the Territorial Commercial Code language. Tonight. She moved toward the horse. This is not over. This is Daltry responding, which means he's worried. A man who isn't worried doesn't send a Helena lawyer in 6 days. Eli helped her mount with a brief steadying hand at her elbow. She was not accustomed to the gesture, and it caught her slightly off guard. He didn't appear to notice. There's something else, she said once they were moving. Prescott's counterfiling includes a character reference for Cooper from 3 Billings businessmen. It's designed to establish Cooper as credible and George as unreliable. She kept her voice steady. One of the 3 names is Owen Buckley. He runs the feed supply on the north end of town. I know Owen Buckley. Is he honest? Eli's jaw shifted. He owes Daltry a line of credit that he's been rolling over for 3 years. So he's not dishonest, Clara said. He's compromised. That's different, and the court will need to understand the difference. She paused. The other 2 names I don't recognize. Harlan Voss and a man named Deakins. Voss is on the town council. Deakins I don't know. They rode in silence for a short stretch. The cold was particular that afternoon, sharp and still, the kind that carried sound farther than usual, so that the hoofbeats seemed louder and voices from the main street carried all the way to the edge of town. Mr. Cutter, Clara said finally, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. The man you arrested, Alderton. She kept her voice even and her eyes forward. You walked away from the badge because you believed your judgment couldn't be trusted. That's what you told me. She paused. But you spent the last 6 months identifying a fraud that most men would have accepted as their own failure. You recognized what Daltry was doing even without the tools to prove it. You held on to every receipt, every letter, every document, even when you didn't know what to do with them. She glanced at him. That is not the behavior of a man whose judgment failed. That is the behavior of a man who was right about the important things and got one terrible thing wrong. Eli said nothing. I'm not saying that to make you feel better, Clara said. I'm saying it because I need you to trust your own read of these men Voss Deacons Buckley when we're building the case. I need your knowledge of this town and the people in it, and I need you to give it to me without second-guessing yourself at every step because you're afraid of being wrong again. She looked at him steadily. Can you do that? The silence lasted long enough that Clara thought he might not answer. I can try, he said. That's enough. That night, Clara found Section 4 again and read it against the full text of the Montana Territorial Commercial Code section by section, her pen moving steadily in the margin. Eli sat across from her reading through the character statements Prescott had filed, making quiet notes in his own hand about each name. At 11:15, Clara stopped. She read the passage again. Then she set her pen down very carefully. Mr. Cutter. He looked up. Section 4 uses the phrase, written notification of default. She turned the document and pushed it across the table to him, her finger on the line. Not notification, written notification. That word is right there in the clause itself. She met his eyes. Prescott's entire verbal notice argument is built on the General Territorial Commercial Code provision for notification of contract parties. But Section 4 specifies written notice as the required form. A specific contractual requirement overrides a general code provision. She kept her voice steady, though her heart was moving faster. Cooper's conversation with George in March was not written notice. It could not have been written notice. And Daltry's own lawyer had to know that when he filed this argument. Eli looked at the passage. He looked up at her. He filed it anyway. He filed it because he's betting that a crowded court docket means nobody reads the clause language carefully enough to catch the specific word. Clara pulled the document back. That is not a defense. That is a stall. He's buying time. Time for what? Clara looked at him. That's the question I've been asking myself for the past hour. She leaned back in her chair. If the verbal notice argument is a stall, then there's something coming that we haven't seen yet. Something he's preparing while Prescott keeps us occupied with the counter-filing. She paused. Is there anyone who could interfere with the county records before the hearing? Any way the original documents could be altered or disappear? Eli's expression went flat and careful. The county recorder is a man named Birch. He's been in that office for 11 years, and he's always been straight. Does he owe anything to Daltry? A pause. Not that I know of. Find out, Clara said quietly. Tomorrow morning before you do anything else, because if Daltry can't win the legal argument, the next move is to remove the evidence that makes the legal argument. Eli stood. He put both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, looking at the spread of documents between them, the months of work, the building pattern, the folders organized in Clara's precise hand. Something moved in his expression that she had been watching develop over the past 6 days. A slow transformation from the closed wariness of their first morning to something more open, and she thought more like the man he must have been before Carson City. You know, he said. When George first told me he'd written those letters, I said things to him I'm not proud of. Clara waited. I told him he had no right to make decisions about my life, that I wasn't some broke-down horse that needed to be managed. He paused. I still believe that, but I also... He stopped, looked at the documents. I was losing this fight. I knew I was losing it, and I didn't know how to stop. And then you got off that stage and walked straight into it, and in 6 days you've—" He stopped again. "Don't," Clara said gently, but clearly. He looked at her. "Don't say it tonight," she said. "Not in the middle of all this. Not when we're both running on too little sleep and too much coffee, and we haven't finished the fight yet." She held his gaze. "Say it when it's over. Say it when we're standing on the other side of it, and we know what we actually have to say." She paused. "Whatever that turns out to be." Eli looked at her for a long, steady moment. "All right," he said. "Good night, Mr. Cutter." "Good night, Miss Whitfield." He left. Clara turned back to her documents. She pulled the Meridian file and opened it and looked at the registration page from Illinois, at the neat columns of names and filing dates, at the chain of paper that connected a Chicago law firm to a Montana holding company, to 3 stolen ranches, and one that hadn't been taken yet. She picked up her pen. She wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What does Prescott's stall give Daltry time to do?" And then 3 lines below it she wrote, "What does Daltry need that he doesn't already have?" She stared at the second question for a long time. Then slowly the answer came to her. Not from the documents. From memory. From a cold afternoon in a Philadelphia courtroom when she was 22 years old, watching Gerald Croft stand at the front of the room and say with complete confidence that her father's signature on a single document was sufficient to transfer the entire firm. From the moment she had understood too late that the fight had not been about the business at all. It had been about one piece of paper that Croft had spent months arranging to exist. She pulled Eli's original loan agreement from the folder. She turned to page 1. She read the signatory block at the bottom. Then she read it again. "Ruth," she called. Ruth appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, in her robe, unhurried and unsurprised by being called at this hour, the way a woman got who had been running a boarding house on the frontier long enough to understand that urgent things rarely waited for morning. "I need to know," Clara said, "whether the original deed to Cutter's Ridge is held at the county recorder's office, or whether Eli holds it personally." Ruth looked at her steadily. "As far as I know, Eli keeps the deed in his strongbox. Same place he kept the loan documents." Clara looked at the loan agreement in her hand. If the deed was at the ranch, and the ranch had 6 hired guns riding out to it at dawn, and Prescott's counterfiling was designed to occupy Clara's attention for the next 2 weeks. "I need a horse," Clara said. "Right now." Ruth did not ask questions. She put on her coat. Ruth's horse was a sturdy gray mare named Patience, which Clara thought was either a good omen or a bad joke given the circumstances. Ruth saddled her in 4 minutes without being asked twice and handed Clara the reins at the back gate with a single instruction. "She pulls left on a downhill. Don't fight her. Let her find her footing." Clara had not ridden hard since she was 16 years old and spent a summer on her uncle's farm in Pennsylvania. But the body remembered what the mind thought it had forgotten, and she was through the south end of Billings and onto the frozen road toward Cutter's Ridge before she had time to think carefully about what she was doing or whether it was wise. The ride was 20 minutes in daylight on a clear day. In the dark on frozen ground with a wind out of the north that cut straight through her coat, it took her 35, and she spent most of it with her teeth clenched and her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, running the logic again and again, because she needed to be right about this. Daltry needed the deed. Not to win the legal argument, she had already closed that door with the written notice language in Section 4. But if Prescott's counterfiling failed, as it would, Daltry's next move would be to attack the validity of the deed itself. Claim it was improperly filed, improperly witnessed, improperly transferred from the original territorial grant. Any irregularity, however minor, however manufactured, could create enough uncertainty to tie the property in dispute for months or years, while Daltry's lawyers worked the system, and Eli bled out financially trying to defend it. To manufacture an irregularity, he needed the original document, and if the original document happened to disappear from Eli's strongbox before the hearing, There was only a county copy, and county copies could be altered by a man who had sufficient leverage over the county recorder. She had asked Eli to check whether Birch was compromised. She had not asked him to move the deed. That was her mistake, and she was fixing it now. The lights were on at the ranch house when she came over the last rise, which meant Eli was still awake, and she felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. She brought Patience to a stop at the rail and was off the horse and at the door before the mare had finished tossing her head at the sudden halt. She knocked once. The door opened in under 10 seconds, which meant Eli had heard her coming and had already moved. He looked at her in the doorway, coat dark circles, the particular expression of someone who had ridden hard and fast in the cold, and something in his face went very still. What happened? Nothing yet. She stepped inside. The deed. Where is it exactly? Strong box under the bed. Why? Get it. Right now. We need to move it somewhere Daltry's men can't reach it before the hearing. Eli looked at her for 1 second, not questioning her, she realized, but reading her the way he had started reading her over the past 6 days, fast and accurate, and then he turned and went up the stairs without another word. She heard him move across the floor above her, heard the scrape of the strongbox, heard him come back down. He set the deed on the table between them. It was a single folded document, heavy paper, the territorial seal pressed into the bottom corner, the signatures clear and properly witnessed. Clara read it quickly and thoroughly, and when she looked up, she felt the tension in her shoulders drop by 1 degree. It's clean, she said. Properly filed, properly witnessed chain of title is clear from the original grant. She looked at him. If this document exists and is in trustworthy hands, Daltry has no angle on the deed itself. But if it stays here, he sends men for it, Eli said. He wasn't asking. Prescott's counterfiling buys him 10 days minimum while the court considers the written notice argument. That's 10 days in which Boggs and 6 riders could come out here any night and go through every room in this house, and by the time anyone proved what was taken, it would be too late. She met his eyes. This document cannot stay at the ranch. Eli picked up the deed and looked at it. Where? Judge Marsh, Clara said. Tonight. If we ride to her house and place this in her personal custody as a material document related to an active filing, it is legally protected from any interference. Nobody touches a document in a judge's custody without her direct authorization. Eli looked up at her. You want to knock on Adeline Marsh's door at midnight. I want to knock on Adeline Marsh's door at midnight, Clara confirmed. A pause. She is going to be deeply unimpressed, Eli said. She is going to be deeply unimpressed, and she is going to accept the document anyway, because she is a judge who understands chain of custody, and she will recognize immediately why we're there. Clara held his gaze. Unless you have a better idea. I don't, Eli said. He picked up his coat. Judge Marsh answered the door herself, which suggested either that she slept lightly or that she had been awake already, and her expression when she saw the 2 of them on her step confirmed it was the latter. She was fully dressed. She held a cup of something hot, and she looked at them with the expression of a woman who had expected something tonight, though perhaps not this specific thing. Miss Whitfield, she said. Mr. Cutter. She looked at the document in Eli's hand. The deed. We believe Daltry intends to interfere with it before the hearing, Clara said. I'm requesting that the court accept it into protective custody as a material document in the active filing. Judge Marsh held the door open wider. Come in. They sat in her front room while she read the deed, and then read it again, and then set it on her writing desk, and looked at both of them with that thorough, unhurried assessment that Clara had decided was simply how Adeline Marsh looked at everything. You rode out here tonight because you worked out the stall strategy, she said to Clara. Yes, Your Honor. Prescott's verbal notice argument was never going to hold. He knows that. You know that. I know it now. I found the written notification language in Section 4 this evening. I found it the afternoon you filed, Judge Marsh said. I was wondering how long it would take you. She tapped the deed with one finger. I'll accept this into court custody. I'll have my clerk issue a receipt tomorrow morning and place it in the official case file. She paused. I'll also be sending a note to the county recorder first thing tomorrow, advising him that any alteration to county property records related to the Cutter's Ridge parcel constitutes contempt of court in an active proceeding. Do you believe Birch is compromised? Clara said. I believe Birch is a man who has a sick wife and medical debts and a line of credit at First Territorial Bank, Judge Marsh said evenly. I believe a note from my chambers reminding him of the legal definition of contempt will clarify his priorities. A pause. You've been building something larger than a defective notice challenge. It was not quite a question. Yes, Your Honor. The pattern across 3 properties. Yes. Judge Marsh looked at her for a long moment. When you have that evidence assembled into a form that can be presented, bring it to me directly. Not through the clerk, directly. She picked up the deed. I have been watching Warren Daltry operate in this county for 3 years. I have 2 rulings against him on record, and a third I've been unable to make because the evidence wasn't sufficient. She met Clara's eyes with a directness that felt like one professional speaking plainly to another. Sufficient evidence would be welcome. They rode back toward Billings in the dark, side by side, not quickly now because the urgency had passed and the cold had deepened, and the horses needed to pick their way carefully over the frozen ground. The wind had dropped. The sky above the Montana plain was enormous and indifferent and brilliant with stars, the kind of sky that existed nowhere Clara had ever lived before, that still made her stop internally and recalibrate every time she was under it. You figured it out and came straight to the ranch, Eli said after a while. You didn't stop to write a note or find a messenger. You just came. There wasn't time to. I'm not criticizing you. He glanced at her. I'm noting it. Clara looked at the road ahead. The deed was at risk. Someone needed to move it. You could have sent someone. Ruth doesn't ride at night, and George was at the ranch anyway. There wasn't. Clara. His voice was quiet and direct. I'm not asking why you came instead of sending someone. I know why. She didn't answer. You've been treating this like it's a case, he said. Like it's a set of documents to be organized, and arguments to be constructed, and a problem to be solved in the most efficient manner possible. It is those things. It's also my home, Eli said. The only thing I've built since Carson City. The only thing I haven't lost or walked away from. He paused. You rode out here in the middle of the night in the cold because you didn't want me to lose it. Not just because it was the logical next move, because you didn't want me to lose it. Clara kept her eyes on the road for a long moment. Don't make it sentimental, she said. It's a sound legal strategy. It is, Eli agreed, and it's also what I said. She didn't argue with that because she had used up her store of precisely accurate counterarguments somewhere around mile 15 on the ride out, and she was tired and cold, and the mare was pulling left on the downhill the way Ruth had said she would. They were nearly back to the edge of town when Eli spoke again. When I arrested Alderton, he said, I was certain. That was the problem. I wasn't careless or lazy. I had evidence, I had a witness. I had a timeline that held together. I was certain, and I was wrong, and a man died for it. He paused. For 3 years I told myself the lesson was, don't trust your own judgment. Don't be certain about anything. Stay small and stay quiet, and don't let yourself matter to anything that can fail. Clara waited. But that's not the right lesson, he said. I've been sitting with the wrong lesson for 3 years. What's the right one? She said. He thought about it. The right one is that certainty without humility kills people. That evidence has to be tested, not just accumulated. That being thorough isn't the same as being right. He paused. The right lesson is, do the work carefully and stay open to being wrong, not stop working because you might be. The lights of Billings were visible ahead. Clara could see the lamp in Ruth's front window, which Ruth had apparently left burning, and something about that small, steady light at the end of the road made her throat tighten briefly. "That's a better lesson," she said. "3 years late," Eli said. "You got there," Clara said. "That's not nothing." Ruth met them at the door, took one look at them both, and went to the kitchen without a word. She came back with 2 cups of something hot and set them on the table and stood with her arms crossed. "The deed is safe," she said. "Judge Marsh has it," Clara said. Ruth nodded once, the satisfied nod of a woman who had been holding her breath for an hour and was now willing to breathe again. "Sleep," she said. "Both of you. Whatever comes next can wait until morning." What came next did not wait until morning. At 6:45, Deputy Frank Osley knocked on Ruth's door with his hat in his hands and an expression that landed somewhere between apologetic and alarmed. He was young enough that he still showed everything on his face, which Clara had decided was one of his better qualities. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Cutter, there's a situation." "Tell me," Clara said. "Mr. Daltry came to the sheriff's office last night, late after 10. He filed a complaint claiming that you," Osley glanced at Eli, then back at Clara, "that you obtained loan documents from First Territorial Bank under false pretenses. He's saying you represented yourself as Eli Cutter's legal counsel and were given access to account records that should have been confidential." Osley swallowed. "The sheriff is asking you to come in and respond to it this morning." The room was quiet. Clara set down her cup. "I never represented myself as anyone's legal counsel," she said. "I'm not a lawyer, and I've never claimed to be. Every document I've seen was either provided by Mr. Cutter directly from his own files or obtained through the Public Records Office through proper channels." She looked at Osley steadily. "That complaint is false, and Daltry knows it's false." "Yes, ma'am," Osley said in the tone of a man who fully believed her and was nonetheless obligated to deliver the message. "He also says," he stopped. "He says that if Mr. Cutter is allowing an unqualified woman to conduct what amounts to legal practice on his behalf, the court should question the competence of the borrower to manage his own financial affairs." Eli made a sound that was low and not polite. "Osley," he said. "Sir?" "That's Daltry telling the court that a man who relies on a woman's judgment shouldn't be trusted with property." "That's what it amounts to, sir. Yes." Osley had the look of a man who found this assessment deeply stupid and was required by his job to deliver it anyway. Clara looked at Eli. Something had gone very calm in her, the particular calm that arrived when a situation had become simple enough that there were no more decisions to make, only things to do. "Tell the sheriff we'll be there at 9 o'clock, she said to Osley. After he left, Eli turned to her. His jaw was set in the way she had learned to read as controlled anger rather than recklessness. "He's filing false complaints to get you out of the picture before the hearing." "Yes." "He couldn't get to the deed. He couldn't make the verbal notice argument hold. So now, he attacks your standing." Eli's voice was flat and very even. "Because if you're discredited or removed, I'm back to fighting this alone." "That's the calculation," Clara said. "What do we do?" Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled her folder toward her and opened it and took out a single page, the letter from Tom Henley that had arrived 4 days ago, the one with the specific details of the Morrison family's eviction, the name of the midwife who had attended Eleanor Morrison, the address in Red Lodge where the Henleys had resettled. She had been holding this back, waiting for the right moment to use it. Tom Henley's letter says Eleanor Morrison's midwife was a woman named Agnes Poole, she said. It also says that Agnes Poole attended 2 other births in the valley in the past 3 years, both on properties that were subsequently acquired by Meridian Land Associates. Eli looked at her. Agnes Poole knows all 3 families. Agnes Poole is the kind of woman that frontier communities depend on absolutely and overlook completely, Clara said. She's been in and out of every homestead in this valley for the past decade. She's heard things and seen things that never made it into any official record. She paused. She lives 8 miles north of Billings. I know where Agnes lives. Bring her to the sheriff's office at 9 o'clock. Clara closed the folder. Not as a witness to anything yet. Just bring her. Let Daltry see that the people he's been building his system on top of are not as invisible as he thought they were. Eli held her gaze. And you? I am going to the sheriff's office at 9 o'clock, and I am going to answer every question he asks me with complete accuracy, because I have nothing to hide, and Daltry's complaint has no factual basis. She picked up her pen. But first, I'm going to write an affidavit documenting every document I've accessed, every source I obtained it from, and every statement that was made to me or by me in the course of this work. Dated and signed and witnessed by Ruth before we leave this house. Eli looked at her, at the pen in her hand, at the steady composure in her face, at the folder full of 6 days of careful, thorough, methodical work, and she saw in his expression something she had not seen there before. Not the guarded assessment of their first morning. Not the cautious warming of the days that followed. Something clearer than either of those. He doesn't know what he walked into when he filed that complaint, Eli said quietly. No, Clara said. He doesn't. She wrote the affidavit in 40 minutes. Ruth witnessed it at 8:15. At 8:30, Eli rode north to collect Agnes Poole. Clara put on her good dress, the dark blue wool, the one she'd been saving, and braided her hair back precisely, and sat for one moment in the corner room with her hands in her lap. She thought about her father, about his office in Philadelphia, the rows of ledger books on the shelves, the smell of ink and coal smoke, and the particular quiet of a room where careful work was being done. She thought about the afternoon Gerald Croft had stood in that office and told her with perfect politeness that her father's life work was now his. She had been 22 years old, and she had not had the tools. She was 27 now. She had the tools. She had the documents. She had a judge who wanted the evidence, a rancher who had held on to every receipt for 3 years because some part of him had refused to accept that his own careful work meant nothing, and a ranch hand who had done something wrong for the right reasons and had been honest when it counted. She picked up her folder. She walked out into the Montana morning, and she did not look back at the boarding house or the familiar weight of the corner room or the lamp Ruth had left burning. Warren Daltry had built his system on the assumption that the people he was stealing from would be too isolated, too uninformed, and too ashamed to fight back in a language the court would hear. He had been right about that every single time until the morning stage from Helena had pulled into Billings, and a woman with a ledger book and no place else to go had stepped off it into the middle of his next transaction. Clara walked toward the sheriff's office, and the cold air came off the mountains clean and sharp, and she breathed it in and let it settle her. Whatever Daltry had prepared for this morning, she was more prepared. She was certain of that. Not with the blind certainty that had cost Eli 3 years of his life, but with the specific documented evidence-based certainty of someone who had read every piece of paper in this fight and knew exactly where every number led. The numbers always told the truth. She was about to let them speak. Sheriff Dale Purcell was a man who had held his office for 9 years by doing one thing consistently. Well, he knew which direction the wind was blowing, and he adjusted accordingly. Clara had read him in their first 2 minutes together on the morning of the complaint, and had concluded that he was not dishonest. He was careful, which in a town where Warren Daltry held 3 lines of credit over the heads of the business community amounted to roughly the same thing. He sat behind his desk with Daltry's complaint in front of him, and the expression of a man who wished very much that this particular problem had arrived on someone else's watch. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Daltry alleges that you obtained confidential bank records by misrepresenting your professional standing." "I'd like to respond to that allegation with specificity," Clara said. She opened her folder and set the affidavit on his desk. "This document lists every record I've accessed in the past 6 days, the source of each record, and the precise circumstances under which it was obtained. Every bank document in my possession was provided directly by Mr. Cutter from his personal files. Every county record was obtained through the Public Records Office using my own name and paying the standard access fee. I have never represented myself as a lawyer, as legal counsel, or as anything other than what I am, a certified accountant working on behalf of a client. Purcell read the affidavit. He read it carefully, which told Clara that whatever else he was not stupid. Mr. Daltry also suggests, Purcell said with the careful tone of a man reading from a document he found distasteful, that Mr. Cutter's reliance on an unqualified party to manage his legal affairs raises questions about his capacity to... Sheriff. Eli's voice was even. Is there a law in Montana Territory that prevents a man from choosing who helps him manage his own affairs? Purcell opened his mouth, closed it. Because if there is, Eli continued, I'd like to see it written down. And if there isn't, I'd like to understand on what legal basis Warren Daltry is filing complaints about how I conduct my private business. The door behind them opened. Clara heard it before she turned, the particular sound of someone entering without knocking, who had decided that the room was already theirs. She turned to find Warren Daltry in the doorway, and beside him the lawyer Prescott, and beside Prescott, a man she didn't recognize in a good coat, who had the look of someone who had traveled some distance to be here. Daltry was exactly as Ruth had described him. He filled the doorway, not with height, but with the particular density of a man who had never in his adult life been required to make room for anyone else. He looked at Clara the way men like him always looked at women like her, not with hostility, because hostility would have implied she warranted a strong reaction. With a patient dismissive amusement that said she was a temporary inconvenience. Sheriff Purcell, Daltry said pleasantly. I hope I'm not interrupting. Mr. Daltry, Purcell said. I wasn't expecting you personally. I thought given the circumstances I should come myself. Daltry's eyes moved to Clara with the unhurried confidence of a man who had won every fight in this room for 3 years. Miss Whitfield, I've heard a great deal about you this past week. I imagine you have, Clara said. You've caused quite a stir for someone who arrived on the stage 8 days ago with no connections and no standing in this community. He said it pleasantly. That was the most dangerous thing about him, she had decided, the pleasantness. It was the same pleasantness Gerald Croft had used in Philadelphia while he explained with complete warmth that her father's business now belonged to him. I hope you understand that what you're involved in here is considerably beyond your area of expertise. My area of expertise, Clara said, is reading financial documents. The documents in this case are financial documents. She held his gaze. I'm in exactly the right area. Daltry smiled. He turned to Purcell. The man with me is Arthur Vane, senior partner at Aldrich & Price in Chicago. He's traveled here to clarify certain matters related to the Cutter account. Clara felt the change in the room's temperature, not the cold from outside, but the interior shift of a situation moving toward its hinge point. She had 1 second to decide whether what she was about to do was correct, and in that second she ran the logic one final time and found it sound. Aldrich & Price, she said clearly. The firm that registered Meridian Land Associates in Illinois in October of 1879. The room went quiet, not the ordinary quiet of a conversation pausing. The specific quiet of several people simultaneously recalculating. Daltry's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it did a very small adjustment, the way a machine made a sound before a gear slipped. I don't know what you think you know about, Prescott began. Meridian Land Associates, Clara said, and she reached into her folder. Acquired the Henley property at auction in March of 1886, weeks after the family was put off by First Territorial Bank. It acquired the Morrison homestead in August of 1885, weeks after eviction. It acquired the Birch Creek parcel in January of 1881, 4 weeks after the Birch Creek family vacated. She set 3 documents on Purcell's desk side by side. All three properties purchased at auction by the same Chicago holding company, registered by the same Chicago law firm, at prices averaging 31% below the assessed value at the time of sale. She looked at Vane. "Mr. Vane, does Aldrich and Price hold a principal interest in Meridian Land Associates?" Vane looked at Daltry. It was a brief look, barely a second, but it was enough. "I'm not here to answer questions from Arthur." Daltry's voice had changed. Not loud. Lower, actually, and more careful. "That's enough." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who had just told his own lawyer to stop talking in a room full of witnesses, and everyone present understood what that meant. The door opened again. Eli had stepped out 7 minutes earlier after delivering Agnes Poole to the bench in the hallway with the quiet instruction to wait. Now he returned, and behind him came Agnes Poole herself, a woman of 60 or so, compact and direct, with the unhurried manner of someone who had brought enough children into the world and sat with enough dying people to find the pretensions of powerful men mostly tedious. And behind Agnes came Deputy Osley, and behind Osley came Tom Henley, who had apparently not been in Red Lodge at all, but had ridden through the night from wherever he'd actually been, because George's second letter had reached him faster than Clara had expected. Tom Henley was a broad man with a weathered face, and the specific look of someone who had been waiting for permission to be angry for a very long time and had just received it. He looked at Daltry. "Mr. Henley," Daltry said, and his pleasantness was working very hard now. "This is a surprise." "I imagine it is," Tom said. He reached into his coat and put a document on Purcell's desk beside Clara's. "My original loan agreement. My original enforcement notice postmarked 11 weeks after the triggering event. And a signed statement from my wife describing the conversation she had with Cooper at the bank counter in February of 1880, where he informed her that if we contested the enforcement, we would find ourselves dealing with problems that went beyond the loan." He paused. She wrote it all down that same night. She said she wanted to remember exactly what he said. Purcell was looking at the growing pile of documents on his desk with the expression of a man watching a flood come over a levee he had been assured was adequate. Agnes Poole had moved into the room without being invited. She stood near the window and looked at Daltry with no particular expression. "I delivered Eleanor Morrison's baby in a wagon," she said, "in November, because they were put out of their house 3 weeks before her time and had nowhere to go." She paused. "Eleanor lost the baby. It was too cold and too early, and there wasn't anything I could do." Her voice was flat and completely devastating. "I've been thinking about who to tell that to for 14 months. The room held that for a moment. Daltry turned to Purcell. His pleasantness was gone now. What replaced it was something colder and more honest, the actual face of the operation behind the good coat and the gold watch. "Sheriff, this is a manufactured spectacle designed to—" "Mr. Daltry." Judge Adeline Marsh spoke from the doorway. Nobody had heard her arrive. She stood in the entrance to the sheriff's office in her formal coat with 2 of her court officers behind her and a document case under her arm, and she looked at the room with the unhurried authority of a woman who had been managing courtrooms for 23 years and found this particular scene entirely within her experience. "Your Honor," Purcell said, and the relief in his voice was audible. "I was informed that Mr. Daltry had filed a complaint intended to interfere with an active court proceeding," Judge Marsh said. "I've come to address that personally." She looked at Daltry. "A complaint filed in bad faith against a party to an active case in my court constitutes an attempt to obstruct proceedings. Are you prepared to defend the factual basis of your complaint against Miss Whitfield in front of me right now with the record of her work available for examination?" Daltry looked at Prescott. Prescott looked at Vane. Vane had developed the look of a man calculating train schedules. "I'd like to consult with counsel," Daltry said. "You have counsel standing beside you," Judge Marsh said. "Consult quickly." What followed was not quick, but it was conclusive. In the 40 minutes that Prescott spent attempting to construct an argument that would survive contact with the documents on Purcell's desk, the written notice language in Section 4, George Aldridge's sworn account, Tom Henley's filing, Agnes Poole's testimony about Eleanor Morrison, and the complete Meridian Land Associates acquisition record that Clara had laid out in precise chronological order, it became clear to everyone in the room, including Prescott himself, that there was no argument to be constructed. The verbal notice claim was withdrawn at 11:42. The complaint against Clara was withdrawn at 11:51. At 12:08, Judge Marsh looked at Warren Daltry across the sheriff's desk with the expression she had warned Clara imagined when she refused his first two attempts at a favorable ruling, the expression of a woman who had seen enough to know what she was looking at and had no interest in pretending otherwise. "Mr. Daltry," she said, "the enforcement action against Cutter's Ridge is void on its face. I'll be issuing a formal ruling to that effect this afternoon." She paused. Additionally, the pattern of conduct documented across 3 separate properties, the relationship between First Territorial Bank and Meridian Land Associates, and the conduct of bank officers in suppressing payment records and intimidating borrowers will be referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office for investigation. She picked up the documents and squared them precisely. "I'd recommend retaining counsel, not Mr. Prescott, someone with experience in criminal fraud matters." Daltry said nothing. For the first time that morning, he had nothing to say. He left without the pleasantness. Vane left on the next stage to Helena and was not seen in Billings again. Prescott left quietly, which was the most dignified option available to him. The sheriff's office, once they were gone, held the particular stillness of a space from which a great deal of compressed tension had suddenly departed. Ruth had arrived at some point during the proceedings. Clara wasn't sure exactly when, and she stood near the door with her arms crossed and her face composed in an expression that was as close to satisfied as it ever got. Tom Henley shook Eli's hand for a long time without speaking. Agnes Poole accepted a cup of coffee from Osley with the air of a woman who had been owed one for 14 months. Clara stood at Purcell's desk and organized the documents back into her folder with the same precision she had used every other time she had organized them, because the work deserved the same care at the end as it had at the beginning. Her hands were steady. She noted that with a mild surprise, because they had not been steady during the hour before she walked through the sheriff's door. Eli came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just stood there the way he had started standing beside her over the past 9 days, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room, which she had decided was one of the things she respected most about him. "It's done," he said. "The enforcement action is done," Clara said. "The Attorney General investigation is beginning. Those are different things with different timelines." "I know." He paused. "I meant today is done, this morning, this particular fight." Clara closed her folder. She looked at the document case on the desk, at the careful months of work compressed into organized paper. The payment receipts and loan agreements and county records and sworn accounts that had built piece by piece the complete and irrefutable picture of what Warren Daltry had been doing in Billings, Montana for 3 years. "You said something to me on the ride back from Judge Marsh's house," she said. "I said several things." "You said—" She stopped, recalibrated. "You said to say it when the fight was over." Eli turned to face her. He was looking at her the way he had looked at Cutter's Ridge from the road on the morning she arrived. Not the way a man looked at something he was afraid to lose, but the way a man looked at something he had decided finally and completely to stop being afraid of losing. "Is the fight over?" he said. "Not entirely. The Attorney General investigation could take months. The Meridian principals haven't been identified yet. Daltry still has assets and connections, and—" "Clara." She stopped. "Is this fight over?" he said. Specifically, quietly. She looked at him, at the dark eyes that had been assessing and guarded on that first frozen morning and were now simply open, at the man who had stood alone in the snow with a shotgun against 6 riders, and a terrible certainty that today was a fine day to die, and who was standing in the same room with her now in something that looked very different from a man ready to give up. "Yes," she said. "This fight is over." "Then I have something to say." "Go ahead." You came here for a husband you didn't find, and a life you hadn't planned, and a fight that had nothing to do with you, Eli said. You stayed because of the documents, because of what Daltry was doing, and what you could do about it. I know that. I'm not confused about what kept you here. Clara waited. But I also know that for 9 days you have worked harder on my behalf than anyone has worked on my behalf since I was a deputy marshal, with a partner who would ride into bad situations with me without being asked, he said. I know that you rode out to that ranch in the dark because you'd worked out what Daltry was planning, and you couldn't stand the thought of him winning. He paused. And I know that every time I said something worth hearing in the past 9 days you heard it. Not politely. Actually, heard it. He looked at her directly. I haven't been heard like that in a long time. Eli. I'm not finished, she waited. I was a man who had decided the most responsible thing he could do was stop mattering to things that could fail, he said. I had been that man for 3 years, and I was going to be that man for the rest of my life until George Aldridge did something wrong for the right reasons, and you stepped off a stage into the middle of my situation and refused in every possible way to be manageable. He paused. I don't want to stop mattering to you, Clara. I don't want you to file your last document and pack your folder and get on the next stage to somewhere else. I want you to stay. Not because you need a place to stay. Because I want you here. Because this, whatever this is between us, is the first thing since Carson City that has made me feel like the future might be worth preparing for. The room had gone quiet around them, in the natural way of people who recognized the moment and had the decency to stop generating noise. Clara looked at him. She thought about the corner room at Ruth's boarding house and the lamp left burning in the window. She thought about riding through Montana dark on a gray mare named Patience, toward a house lit up from inside. She thought about her father's voice saying the numbers always tell the truth, and about how she had spent 4 years since his death being certain of that and uncertain of almost everything else. She thought about the fact that for 9 days she had not once in any unguarded moment wanted to be anywhere other than exactly where she was. I have conditions, she said. Something moved through his expression, relief, and under it something warmer. Tell me. The account management arrangement we discussed. 3 months' wages. That becomes a permanent position. I manage the books, the correspondence, and the business expansion. Equal voice in financial decisions. Agreed. I keep my own name on the professional filings. Clara Mae Whitfield, not Mrs. Cutter. Agreed. And the Attorney General investigation, I continue to lead the document work on that. It's my case, and I intend to see it through. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. She looked at him for one more moment. All the careful calculation, and the precise management of distance, and the professional composure that had carried her through 9 days of the hardest work she had ever done. She let it rest for a moment. Just a moment. All right, she said. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands, the way a man handled something he understood to be both durable and worth treating gently. When he kissed her, it was unhurried and certain the way he did everything that mattered, with complete attention and no wasted motion. Ruth Nakamura from across the room made a sound that was not quite a comment and not quite a dismissal, and turned to Tom Henley and asked whether he wanted more coffee. Tom Henley said he did. Agnes Poole finished hers and set down the cup, and said she had 2 pregnancies to check on, and a county that needed to understand what had happened to Eleanor Morrison, and she walked out with the rolling, purposeful stride of a woman who had never once in her life waited for someone else to tell her that the work was worth doing. Deputy Osley looked at the ceiling with the studied neutrality of a young man who had decided some things were above his pay grade. The formal ruling came down that afternoon as Judge Marsh had promised. The enforcement action against Cutter's Ridge was void. The deed was clean. The ranch was Eli's, as it had always been, as it had been through every notice and every false claim, and every morning he had stood his ground because some part of him had refused, even in 3 years of deliberately making himself small, to stop believing the ground was worth standing on. The Attorney General's investigation opened 6 weeks later. The Meridian principals were identified in February, 2 of them officers of First Territorial Bank's parent company in Chicago. The third, a territorial land speculator with connections to the railroad expansion survey. The case took 14 months to build, and Clara built it document by document with the same precision she had brought to the first challenge filing. And when she presented the complete record to the territorial court in Helena in the spring of 1884, it held together exactly as she had constructed it. Warren Daltry resigned from First Territorial Bank in March of 1883 before the indictment. It did not help him. The Henley family received a settlement. The Morrison family received a settlement, though no amount of money gave Eleanor Morrison back what she had lost in that wagon in November. And Clara kept that knowledge close and let it remind her in the months when the work was slow and technical and exhausting. Exactly why it was worth doing. Cutter's Ridge in the summer of 1883 was a different place from the ranch Clara had ridden toward in the dark 9 months earlier. The herd was rebuilt. The pasture fences were repaired. George Aldridge had spent a month mucking stalls as agreed and had emerged from the experience with a deeper appreciation for accurate record-keeping that made him. Clara told Eli, the most reformed ranch hand in Montana Territory. On a late August evening, with the sky going amber and gold over the mountains, and the air carrying the particular sweetness of summer grass and clean water, Clara sat at the table in the ranch house with the last of the Attorney General files organized in front of her, and her pen set down beside them, and she looked at the work complete and felt the specific quiet satisfaction of a thing finished correctly. Eli came in from the pasture and set his hat on the peg by the door. He came to the table and looked at the organized files and then at her. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He pulled her out of the chair, and she let him because the work was finished, and she was allowed to be done being precise about everything for at least one evening. He held her the way he had learned to hold her completely, and without reservation, the way a man held something he had stopped being afraid to lose, because he had finally understood that the holding itself was the point. Outside, the Montana sky was enormous and indifferent and brilliant, the kind of sky that had no interest in the small human stories unfolding beneath it and did not need to. The stories carried themselves. Clara Mae Whitfield had come to Billings, Montana with a ledger book and no place else to go. And she had built something true from the wreckage of a lie, not a life she had imagined or planned or been promised, but a life that was hers in every document and every decision and every line of careful black ink on honest paper built beside a man who had learned at considerable cost the right lesson from the wrong catastrophe. The numbers had told the truth. They always did.